Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to data mining, lecture number 16. Uh, so today we plan to have a review session before the midterm exam, which is scheduled on Saturday. So the idea for today is I will briefly describe the format of the midterm exam and the conditions that we'll be following for the midterm exam. We will then briefly discuss the syllabus that will be covered or tested in the midterm exam. And then, of course, if you have any questions regarding the content that we have covered so far, we can discuss them during this session. So that is the idea for today. So are there any questions or comments before we get started? All right. Okay, so as you know, your midterm exam is scheduled on Saturday. So the exam would start at 11 a.m. You are required to be available on Zoom sharp at 11 a.m. And please also plan to have your camera available during the exam because having your video on throughout the exam is required. So plan accordingly, knowing that camera is required for the exam. So you will join the session using the same Zoom link that we use for the lectures, like the ones that you use for joining today. So same Zoom link will be used for the exam as well. So the exam would have two parts. The first part would be on LMS test and quizzes. So this part would have about 20 questions that would be answered in about 40 minutes. The format would be similar to the one that you saw in the quizzes. You'll have MCQ, short answers, and some short computations. After this, you will have about 10 minutes break, and then you have part B. Part B should be done on paper and using a pen and paper. So this would be about 1 hour long, and there will be about 3 to 4 questions. So after the end of this period, you will be given about 10 minutes to scan and upload your solution on LMS assignments. So a separate tab for this submission would be made on LMS assignment. So essentially that's the format. So you will start at 11 and most likely you will be done by around 1:15, 1:30. So the exam is in a way open book, open notes. You can use the content that you have already prepared for the course, meaning that you can use notes, you can use slides, you can even use book if you have that available. You can also look up some of this content if it's already available that you have saved on your computer or mobile phone. You are not allowed to do any browsing or searching during the exam. So searching, browsing during the exam is not allowed. So you cannot use the web or internet. And of course, you are not allowed to interact or communicate with anyone else during the exam. Okay? So each one has to do his or her own work based on whatever he or she has understood of the question as well as of the content in this course. Okay? So your video would be on throughout the exam, and the TAs may keep track of you during the exam. So that was about the format. So any questions so far? Any questions?
सर एरिया अंडर कर्व किस तरह फाइंड आउट करते हैं हम लोग?
Area under the curve. अच्छा.
Yes sir.
You're talking about the AUC, right? ठीक है. So, okay, I'll answer this question. Just give me 5 more minutes. Let me quickly go over the syllabus or the content for the course. So very quickly, so what we covered in this course so far, we had introduction, which is chapter 1 of your main textbook by Han. So introduction has a number of things: motivation, definition, the KDD process. Also, we talked about some of the challenges in data mining. There is also some discussion on the disciplines that make up data mining, some history, maybe even, of course, motivational examples, applications. So all of this was introduction. Okay. We also actually discussed things like the KDD process, which is the process that were discussed in the book. We also briefly discussed some industry processes like the CRISP DM and the AUSM. So then we moved on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is basically data understanding. So this chapter kind of started off with types of attributes, their characteristics, and then we talked about various statistics that can be statistics as well as visualizations that you can use to understand or get a better idea of the data. So we talked about central tendency, dispersion tendency, some graphs like the quantile plots or the distribution plots, histograms. So you can't see the screen?
The screen, but it's too much zoomed in, so the text box. No, sir, we can see the screen, but it's too much zoomed in, so that's why the text portion is not visible to us.
Acha.
Yeah,
Let me see. Zoom in किस तरह हो गया? Is the screen still? It's fine now.
No, I think, sir.
One second. Let me stop the screen share. Is it still fine or there's some issue?
Sir, it was fine for me, I guess, earlier, and still now it's fine. I don't know what is the issue.
Yeah.
Sir Namath.
Okay. Okay. So apparently it's fine. Okay. All right. So data understanding was the next main chapter, as I said, talks about statistics and visualization. And then we talked about data preprocessing. So data preprocessing was a kind of a survey chapter that covers a lot of topics. Those topics were kind of divided into some categories. We talked about data cleaning, we talked about data integration, talked about data reduction, data discretization. So within each of those categories, we discussed a number of techniques, things like how we can do data cleaning. For example, what are the stats that you can use to detect duplicates and redundancy in data, which is used in data integration. We talked about sampling techniques, we talked about dimensionality reduction, we talked about feature selection, feature extraction. And then, of course, we talked about discretization at the end. So one thing I wanted to highlight is, obviously, if you look at the book chapter, it has some other topics. So those topics that we did not cover in class explicitly, especially for this chapter, are not included. For example, in the book chapter, you will see things on wavelet compression or compression-based techniques. So those techniques are hardly used in practice. So those are not part of the syllabus. So then we talked about chapter 5. We moved on to chapter 5, which was on frequent pattern mining. So this was actually chapter 5 and 6, because there's some advanced topics that we covered from 6. So of course, in this chapter, we started with the introduction, motivation. We discussed the a priori algorithm, the epic growth. We talked about the vertical data format approach for finding frequent item sets. We also discussed association rules, how to generate association rules from frequent patterns. So we discussed various extensions to the a priori framework as well. So that is also part of it. So we talked about the max pattern, the close pattern. Of course, we did not discuss specifically techniques that find max and close pattern directly. So those are also in the textbook. So that is not part of the syllabus or content for the course. So after this, we talked about sequential pattern mining, and we discussed the GSP algorithm, generalized sequential pattern. And then we spent some time on measures for frequent patterns. We also briefly talked about the distinction between observational analysis and causal inference or experimental design. So we talked about some extensions like the, what do you call that? The frequent predicate sets, frequent item sets, predicate sets, sequential patterns, application regarding multidimensional association rule mining, multi-level association rule mining. We then talked about finally about constraints in data mining and its application to item set mining. So, and then finally we started talking about cluster analysis, which I think is chapter 10, chapter 9, I think. So clustering. So in clustering, we had introduced the idea of clustering, and then we discussed similarity measures, and then we talked about one clustering algorithm so far, which is the k-means clustering. So this is essentially what is going to be tested in the midterm exam. So any question on this? All right, no questions. Okay, the question that was asked earlier was about AUC, area under the ROC curve. So this measure is used in multiple places, but In our context, we introduce this in the context of finding a relationship between two attributes. Okay, cluster analysis is okay. I'll do that on after class. But the slides that I'm using, as you have seen already, are exactly the same as the textbook slides. They are not any much differences. So maybe कुछ slides मैंने delete की होंगी या छोटी मोटी modification है, but you can always use those as well. Okay. So area under the ROC curve is used for finding relationship or correlation. One example of relationship between two attributes. One of the attribute must be continuous, the other must be discrete. And the idea in AUC is how does the continuous attribute or how does the discrete attribute help in, I would say, how does the continuous attribute help in classifying the or distinguishing between the values of the discrete attribute. So इसको compute किस तरह करते हैं? Of course, I gave you an example last time, kind of straightforward. So we can take an example again maybe. So example ले लेते हैं, let's say income, or let's say this is a continuous attribute income, and the discrete attribute हम ले सकते हैं gender ले लें, फिर से gender ले लेते हैं. So by the way, the gender, the other attribute, in this case gender, must be binary or two-valued. AUC primarily works for two-valued discrete attributes. So, and for this data set, you will have to sort the data set using the value of the continuous attribute, in this case income. So let's say मैं income 10 लेता हूँ, this is female. 20 लेता हूँ, this is, let's say again female. 30 लेता हूँ, let's say this is male. 40 लेता हूँ, let's say this is male. And let's say 50 लेता हूँ, this is, let's say female. ठीक है? और 60 लेता हूँ, let's say this is male again. ठीक है? So मेरे पास कितने हो गए? 6 हो गए. Maybe take one more. 70 लेता हूँ, this is male again. ठीक है? So we have sorted the discrete attribute based on the values of the continuous attribute. So we have 3 females and 4 males, right? Okay. So you can find the AUC by using one of the values as an anchor and then computing the AUC, anyone. Of course, depending on which one you take, the value might be different. It will be a complement. As you know, AUC varies between 0 and 1. 0.5 means that there is no relationship. A higher value means that there is a relationship. Lower value means there is a relationship. And if you start with F, you might get a value that is on the upper segment between 0.5 and 1. If you start with M, you'll get a complementary value on the lower segment. So कोई भी आप use करके आप निकाल सकते हैं. So let's look at, so let's count Fs that appear before M. ठीक है ना? So पहला F था, दूसरा भी F था, तीसरा M था. So पहला F के पहले कोई M नहीं है, sorry, we are counting Fs that appear before M. So पहला M जो था third पे आ रहा है, तो उससे पीछे कितने Fs हैं? 2 हैं. ठीक है? And then we look at the next M. Next M कहाँ आ रहा है?
सर फर्स्ट M का वेरी नेक्स्ट सेकंड M है.
2 M आ रहे हैं, 50 F है और 60 M 70. ठीक है. So 2 plus, so do you have 1m? So we have again 2 before this, right? And then you have 3 plus 3. तो 4 हमारे पास m's थे, उन 4 m's की वैल्यूज आ गई हैं. वो क्या वैल्यूज हैं जो f's उससे पीछे आ रही हैं. ठीक है ना? So this is the numerator. And denominator is basically 3 into 4, which is your product of the number of males and females. So 833. So this is a value which is much higher than 0.5. So it means that they are strongly related. In other words, you can use the income. So if someone tells me an income value, which is, let's say, 20 or 30, I can say with a high degree of certainty that that income would most likely belong to a female. So you can detect the label based on the value of the continuous value. ठीक है, तो इसको आप flip कर देंगे तो आपको complementary result आ जाएगा. Let's try find that as well. So अब आपने count करना है males that appear female before females. So पहले आपके पास 0 है, फिर आपके पास 0 है, right? पहले 2 females के पीछे male कोई नहीं आ रहा. And then we have third female के पीछे शायद मेरे ख्याल से 2 males हैं, if I'm not mistaken. And that's it. 3 into 4. So this is the value that you get. And you notice that this is kind of complementary on the other extreme. But both of these values show that there is a strong relationship between these two attributes. So is this question clear now?
Yes, sir.
All right. Are there any other questions? So for the part,
Quantile plot,
जी बताएं.
क्वांटाइल प्लॉट और क्वांटाइल प्लॉट ये सेम चीज़ है कि ये कोई डिफरेंट है दोनों में कुछ?
The quantile plot usually has quantiles on one axis. The other axis may have its value. तो एक एक्सिस में क्वांटाइल होगा उसका और दूसरे में उसकी वैल्यू होगी. The quantile plot है, it's plotting two different attributes with respect to the quantiles. ठीक है. So in other words, जैसे scatter plot होता है ना, दो attributes होते हैं. एक x axis में let's say आपके पास income है, y axis पे age है. ठीक है ना. तो इसी तरह जब क्वांटाइल प्लॉट होगा, x एक्सिस पे इनकम की क्वांटाइल होगी, y एक्सिस पे एज की क्वांटाइल होगी. So if you talk about just the quantile plot, तो उसमें x एक्सिस पे क्वांटाइल्स होंगे, y एक्सिस पे फॉर एग्जांपल इनकम होगी. And the quantile plots gives you an idea of the distribution of the data. So it is much more expressive than, for example, the 5-number summary. The 5-number summary only gives you some points on the distribution, like the min, the max, the median, the Q2, the Q1, and the Q3, while the quantile plot is all the values over the distribution. Also, I think in chapter 2, there is a section on some more advanced visualization techniques. I think you can do that look at that as a quick reading, but you don't have to go into the details of how each graph is created. For example, उसमें बड़े different किस्म के visualizations बताई हुई हैं, pixelated visuals and so on. So just you can take a quick look. In class हमने discuss नहीं किया, but you can do a reading over that just to get a quick idea. Anything else? So candidate hashing, okay, so that's with respect to the a priori approach. Okay, so we did not discuss that in too much detail, but okay, let me revise that. So the idea for hashing in the a priori algorithm was to kind of reduce the workload of managing the candidates. So remember, in the a priori algorithm, the number of candidates that are generated can be very large. And then once those candidates are generated, you will have to count them through the database by going over the database. So this tedious task of generation as well as counting is kind of managed through the hashing process. And the management is more of a quantization. Quantization का मतलब ये है कि groupings हम बना रहे हैं और फिर based on those groupings, rather than discarding one item set at a time, we discard the entire bin. So you need to have a hash function. So so let's say you will have some number of bins. So usually number of bins would be odd numbers. Of course, this is the whole theory of hashing जो हम यहाँ discuss नहीं करना चाहेंगे. But just to give an example, number of bins कोई होंगे आपके पास. Let's say आपके पास 11 bins हैं, for example. ठीक है? And then whenever you generate an item set, let's say item set आपके पास कोई generate हुआ 3 item set है, A, B, C, let's say. So A, B, C को कोई hash function hash करेगा to one of those 11 bins. ठीक है? So hash function usually a modulo something 11 होगा so that you get a number between 0 and 10, for example. ठीक है? So of course I'm not going over the details of the hash function. वो कुछ भी हो सकता है. So let's say ये ABC is hash to let's say bin number 3. So bin number 3 में आपने इसको डाल दिया. And let's say कोई और आपके पास है A, C, D, ये भी 3 में चले गया, and so on. And then some others, let's say B, C, D, ये 4 में गया, and let's say C, D, E, ये भी 4 में गया, and so on. ठीक है? So the point here is that so whenever you generate an item set, you hash it as well as you do a count over it in the database. Okay? So if the count of all the item sets in a particular bin is still less than the number of the minimum support for an item set, it means that each of those so let's say हम bin 3 की बात करते हैं. So bin 3 की, so we have ABC. So let's say ABC का count मेरे पास 2 आता है, ACD का count मेरे पास भी 2 आता है. ठीक है? इन दोनों का sum क्या है? Sum 4 है. Let's say मेरे पास minimum support count जो थी वो 5 थी. ठीक है? So which means that you don't need to keep the entire bin. Further checking करने की आपको जरूरत नहीं है. Just drop the entire bin. So उस bin में यहाँ तो मैंने सिर्फ 2 बताया ना, there might be hundreds of item sets in a particular bin depending on your problem size. The whole bin is then dropped and your size reduced immediately for processing. So this is the basic idea of hashing, managing candidates as well as counting through hashing. Of course, if you look at the paper, उसमें थोड़ी बहुत और tweaks भी हैं, but वो detail हमने course में cover नहीं की. इसका I think paper DHP के नाम से है, Dynamic Hashing something DHP algo. तो इस algo को आप search up करेंगे internet पे तो you might find some more details.
Google has this result.
I don't know, मेरा शायद मोबाइल पड़ा होता तो उस पे Google Assistant चल पड़ा था. I didn't say hey Google. Okay, was there any question here? Someone I think asked a question. Okay. For part B, you have to do things with pen and paper. So uske liye thodi si practice would be helpful. Practice in things that are dealing with numbers and item sets and stuff like that. So this would be useful for, let's say, item set mining, for even clustering, or for some topics in, let's say, data preprocessing. For example, जैसे क्या हो सकता है, for example, some of those measures that we use, chi-square हो गया या कोई और में AUC की बात हुई थी अभी. तो so these are some of the things that you need to have some practice on, especially for part B. A में भी छोटे-छोटे questions आ सकते हैं, but part B के लिए ज़्यादा useful है. So you should use a calculator wherever necessary. And also for part B, there will be points for your working. So don't try to cut things short. तो उसमें working आप दिखाएं अपनी. So any other question? ठीक है, so apparently questions नहीं हैं. तो what else? So GSP जो algorithm है, that is taken from another book. वो book का मैंने chapter upload कर दिया था resources में. तो which is chapter I think 2 of that book, but उसका section 2.6 or 2.7 है. Of course, the other sections of that chapter are on association rule mining, item set mining. Supplementary reading आपने करनी है तो वो आप कर सकते हैं वहाँ से. But the required material from that chapter is 2.6 and 7. As I mentioned last time कि clustering के लिए हम दूसरा जो book है Introduction to Data Mining की भी chapter use करेंगे. But मेरे ख्याल से mid के लिए वो ज़रूरत नहीं है. Because we have just started. You can focus on just the Han and Camber book for clustering, but of course उसमें काफ़ी कुछ चीज़ें बेहतर दी हुई. For example, K-means में उसमें बेहतर discuss हुआ हुआ है. But I think for the mid, one textbook might be sufficient. अच्छा. So are there any other questions? So I think if there are not too many. There are no questions. We'll, I think, stop shortly. So next week we will restart with our new content. We are discussing clustering. So clustering would take another week or so, and then we'll talk about outlier analysis. We'll also talk about classification. As I mentioned earlier on, we'll discuss decision trees briefly, and then we'll talk about some more topics, primarily on spatial temporal data mining. And then I think we'll be at the end of the semester. So इस मंडे को फिर क्विज तो नहीं होगा मोस्ट लाइकली, तो क्विज इंशाल्लाह फिर हम नेक्स्ट फॉलोइंग मंडे से स्टार्ट करेंगे. तो 2 वीक्स आपके क्विज की ब्रेक हो जाएगी, बट वी विल स्टार्ट फ्रॉम द फॉलोइंग मंडे.